Game design is a very blanket statement, and while it's not always black and white, we can all agree that some of these tropes are just terrible, and they have been around for a very long time. Despite all the complaints that these AAA companies get, they like to keep implementing these awful game designs, and so I wanted to go through some of my most hated ones to see. So this first one might seem like a little bit nitpicky, but I just hate it. Unskippable cutscenes. I know, like, you want to see the story that's part of the game, and I agree. I generally don't skip cutscenes, unless I'm playing through the game for a second time, or a third time. Or it's a game like Borderlands 3 has non-skippable cutscenes, and that's a game that you're going to play through over and over and over, trying on higher difficulties to get better loot. You're going to be fighting the same bosses over and over, and always experiencing these long cutscenes, some of which are a little cringeworthy, that you have to watch through every single time. It's not like the game is super long. You're gonna beat it a lot more than once if you're into looter shooters. I absolutely hate it. Now, we also have games like the original Kingdom Hearts and games like Final Fantasy X that were known for their long cutscenes. Not only could you not skip them, you had something a lot worse than that. Because they're RPG-like games, you have save points, so you go save at the save point, and then you go forward and fight the boss. There's usually a couple minute long cutscene, and then you fight the boss. If you die, you go back to your save point, and when you get to fight the boss again, you have to watch through the entire cutscene again. That's the one upside to Borderlands 3, is that even after you watch that long cutscene for a boss fight, when you respawn at the respawn station and you go back to the boss again, you don't have to rewatch the cutscene. You only have to watch it once per playthrough. I can't English. I really hate that in like Final Fantasy X and the original Kingdom Hearts, you couldn't do that. To be fair, Square Enix did fix it. When they remastered and re-released Kingdom Hearts 1, they added skippable cutscenes, which just made things so much better. And Kingdom Hearts 2 and forward, you can skip the cutscenes. I'm pretty sure you can skip them in 3. I could be wrong on that. I think one of the best examples that shows these AAA developers that people don't like unskippable cutscenes is in the first Destiny game, where, once again, you had long cutscenes that you couldn't skip. Even if you've seen them 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times, even if you're using the same character, you have to watch them again and again. It got so bad that I found this thread on Reddit while researching this, where people were talking about how could you possibly skip these cutscenes, and somebody actually learned a way. At the beginning of the cutscene, it still lets you return to orbit even though a cutscene is playing. If you return to orbit and go through that loading screen, which Destiny was known for having long loading screens, it would skip the cutscene and still mark the mission as complete. So people were willing to sit there and go through a long loading screen to return to orbit, which they might have to do after some fights anyways, just so that way they could skip over the cutscenes that they've seen a million times. So, arguably a lot worse than unskippable cutscenes are ones that let you skip it, but don't let you pause it. A lot of games will let you press the pause button, and it just pauses the cutscene. You don't have to sit there and watch the entire thing if you have to get up or do whatever. But for some reason, some of these games, you press a single button, be it start or A or X, depending on your console, or space on the keyboard or escape, and it just skips the cutscene instantly. No, hold this button down for so long, or press this and then this to skip it. No, it just skips. I learned that the hard way when I started streaming Devil May Cry 5 not that long ago, where we were on stream, and I went to pause a cutscene because I was talking to chat, and it just skipped it. And I could have gone to YouTube and looked up the cutscene, but not only did I not want to do that on stream, it's just, why would I have to do that in the first place? Let me pause it. Devil May Cry 5 is probably the worst offender on this, because at least on console, with whether you're on Xbox or PS4, you can press the home button, and it'll actually suspend the game. So it has the game like paused in the background, which also pauses cutscenes. Some games don't do that. When you suspend the game and pressing the home button, it still continues to play in the background. Devil May Cry 5 is one of those. I can't confirm for Xbox, but on PS4, when you press the home button, you don't see the cutscene anymore. It's on your home screen, but the cutscene still continues to play without you being able to watch it. Why? Just add a pause button. Alright, so now it's time for the fun one. You guys love invisible walls in games, right? We're not just gonna talk about that, though. We're also gonna be talking about barriers that just make no sense and kill any immersion you have while playing the game. Earliest example of this that I could think of was in the original Pokemon games, and they still do it in some of the more modern ones as well, where you have a tree in front of you, and you have to learn cut to get through. Now I get it, it's a way to make the player have to go back and do other stuff to basically pad the game for time, essentially. It's a tree. Trees generally grow like 5-6 feet apart because of their roots. And I get it, it's like a fantasy world, so it doesn't have to follow those same rules. But you can see clearly that it's the leaves and the brush on top that's taking up most of the space, which is going to be way above your head. And even if it's not, you can duck or even crawl. I don't know why you had to just go back and learn a way to chop down this tree when you could have just gone around it. Staying with Pokemon, they also have those low ledges. If you guys know what I'm talking about, in the original games especially, you would have these, they looked like ropes to me. As a kid, I always thought they were ropes. I didn't know that they were ledges. But the idea is that you can't go up them, but you can go down them. First off, if it's low enough that a kid can jump down it, then they should be able to get up it. Not only that, but we're in a world where we have these monsters that you can fly on. And you have people like Machoke, who are like giant things made out of rock, who could just pick you up with his one hand and lift you up above the ledge. It's like as high as your ankles, especially when you look at like Diamond and Pearl, where you can actually see just how low the barrier actually is. We can have the smallest possible Pokemon, like a Pidgey, be able to carry you across the map. But we can't, like, squash a few Caterpies to climb up over that lip. Now, I know, I'm just kind of complaining, it's not a big deal. It's an RPG, they needed ways to make the environment more interactive, more, walls and things that make it to where it's not just a giant open square field. So, why don't I move on to something else that makes a little bit more less sense? Alan Wake is actually a game that I really enjoyed. I know it's not necessarily the best, but I enjoyed the story, the gameplay was pretty fun. Kind of stressed me out a little bit, I don't really do horror games, it was really suspenseful. I hate the fact that you are in the middle of the woods, right? You got cabins, you have all these pathways that you're going through, most of the game is spent in the woods, but you can't go in the woods. Same thing with Pokemon. The Alan Wake developers decided, no, these trees are too close together. You can't get past these trees. There's no way to get past, even though it's like a regular forest and you can just walk into them. There's just an invisible wall between the trees so you can't run into the woods when you're running from demons and all of the other things in Alan Wake. I don't understand it. Understand, there are good examples of invisible barriers. Like, people are like, well, how are they going to do it? I know that's the biggest complaint people are going to have about this. They have to. They can't let the player roam an entire world. They can't make that much space. That's true. You can do it in better ways. Very good example is in Skyrim. And generally, any Elder Scrolls game. When you go to the edge of the Providence's boundary, when you reach the end of the player's map, they leave it open, place an invisible wall, and say you can't go any further that way. You cannot blame them for doing that. There's nothing else that they can do. They can't just have this giant, like, Trump wall all around the entire Providence and say, oh yeah, in the world of Elder Scrolls, every single country has these giant walls around them. Like, I can't blame them for that. Then you have Halo 3 with some other multiplayer maps, like Sandlot, where when you go out of the map, the Guardians kill you. They have these giant towers up there, and they punish you for leaving the map, for going into their territory. And it gives a lore reason for why you cannot leave that area. You have the old Star Wars Battlefront 1 and 2 games, when you're doing the flight missions. If you fly too far away from the battlefield, your commander actually calls you on the radio and tells you to stop being a coward and return to the battlefield. If you don't, he kills you. Your ship explodes. It's a creative, good way to keep the player within the play area and not, throw up an invisible wall or lock them in because this tree is too big. There are creative ways to do this, and a lot of developers just don't. The last thing I want to say about invisible barriers, and this applies to basically any zombie or horror game, is when you have just a pile of rubble. and that's it, blocking your path. I don't know why during a zombie apocalypse people just want to like pile up bookshelves and chandeliers in this hallway to block off their only escape. Why that suddenly becomes a thing, but it doesn't make sense. When you have a bookshelf that's angled like this across the hallway, you can go under it, you can go over it, you can pick up the bookshelf. When I just don't understand the excuse of this pile of rubble is blocking off this hallway. Maybe, just maybe, have a double door that's locked. Or don't have a hallway that keeps going. If you want the player to stop right here, then have the hallway stop right there. There's no need for that pile of rubble. Now you can still put stuff in that, you don't just leave a blank wall. You still need to add on to that like horror experience. You can still put a pile of rubble there up against the wall. Something that makes it seem more realistic and doesn't make you go, oh hey, I can definitely go this way, there's space for me. But there's not. So I also wanted to briefly touch on escort missions. I know for those of you that have played Resident Evil 4, you already know I was going to be talking about that. I hate escort missions. They can be done well, but they rarely are. Most of the time because the AI of the person that you're escorting is just terrible. On the upside, with Resident Evil 4, although Ashley likes to run at the zombies like they want a hug or something, at least you can make her hide in a dumpster, you can get her out of your way and then do your business without her being a worry, aside from her constantly yelling for you and giving you a splitting migraine. But then you have games like Oblivion. And this is the biggest example I think most of you guys might have played that has my most hated thing with escort quests. When your walking speed is slower than the NPC's walking speed, it is terrible. Because they're walking faster than you when you're falling behind. So then you decide to sprint. But turns out your sprinting speed is faster than their walking speed. So now they're walking and you just fly past them, and then you have to stop. You have to constantly go from walking to sprinting to stopping, walk, sprint, stop, over and over and over. Every escort mission in Oblivion was like that, and I hated it. There are still a lot of games that do it to this day. I don't know how many I can name off of the top of my head, but I think Oblivion was still just the best example of how not to program your AI for escort missions. I absolutely hated it. Now, when you're playing an open world game, it doesn't necessarily open world, necessarily just 3D, really, and you have full control of the camera, it feels great. You can see the world around you, you can move the camera to where it's best to see what the next jump is going to be, where all of the enemies are. Sometimes games that have these controls like to just get rid of them for certain scenes, and it makes no sense. I think my most aggravating example of this is Beyond Good and Evil. I know it's an older game, and I keep referencing older games. I play a lot of old games, alright? I played through Beyond Good and Evil about 1.5 or 2 years ago, and it was a great game, don't get me wrong, I freaking loved that game. But sometimes the camera would just lock you when you were in certain rooms. Like a tight corridor or whatever, they would decide, okay, we can't let them free cam in here. Understandable with that time period's technology, the camera might go through the walls or whatever. But when they lock it at just impossible angles, and you can't see where that platform is in front of you need to jump to, and you think it's a lot closer than it is, and then when you jump you realize it's actually a lot further and you just fall into a pit. And then you die because of the game's awful camera angle. We had the same issue with Super Mario 64. I can't complain much about that. It was the first real, 3D platformer. They didn't really have much of an option. I mean, with the N64, you basically had the joystick. That's what you used to move. You didn't have two joysticks like on modern controllers. But they had the same issue. I remember, especially as a kid, getting to Bowser's Castle, and there was this one jump, and if I can find the footage, I'll put it up for you guys. If I can find the exact part I'm talking about. Where it is the exact same thing as in Good or Evil. It looks like it's a really close jump, but it just isn't. You have to get to the very edge before you leap, and you have to do a long jump. When it looks like you can practically just walk off onto the next platform. I hate games that do this. I get sometimes it's limitation, sometimes they can't let it, let you control the camera. But at the very least, give us an angle where maybe just from the side, where we can actually see the distance to the next platform. Now, of course, when I mention bad cameras, all the Sonic games come to mind, especially Sonic 06. I don't know of any Sonic games, aside from the old ones, we'll talk about the Sonic 3D games, that have had good cameras. I remember Sonic Unleashed would actually give you cameras, free control of the camera when you're playing in the werewolf form for the night levels, which was fine. The light levels were awful, they were boring, but at least you had control of the camera. During the day stages, the camera would just go from being behind you and whip around in front of you really quick for no reason and block the view of whatever you were trying to look at was coming up ahead. Whether it's an enemy or a jump coming up. It's just like, oh, you wanted to see that? No, you get to go into it blind. Why is it so hard to make a 3D Sonic game? It can't actually be that bad, right? I have too many examples for these. I mean, you have Luminous City in Pokemon X and Y, which is this giant sprawling city, and it's basically just a giant circle. And when you're walking around it, your camera flips to be behind your back, no matter where you're looking. So, with all of how big the city is, and how many of the buildings don't actually matter to you, they're just there to fill empty space, the city gets really confusing, because amongst that giant circle, there are cross streets going through the center. So you never really know what part of the city you're in. It's awful. That is the worst city in any Pokemon game. We had the same issue with Devil May Cry 3. Growing up, I hated the awful camera angles in that game, all these set cameras. You had Mario Galaxy, which, to be fair, I played very little of, but I heard a lot of complaints about the awful camera work in Super Mario Galaxy. You had Resident Evil 1 through 3 with the tank controls, where the camera was almost like a security camera up in the top right corner or left corner, wherever it was in the room. You could barely see what you're interacting with, let alone knowing, like, what direction the joystick needs to go in to aim and shoot. There are too many examples of these. I just wanted to complain about that. Let's move on. So out of all the things I've talked about before, this last one is my biggest complaint to see in any modern game. And that is when the tutorial is either stupid long when it really has no need to be, or when it just treats you like you're a baby. I think we can all agree Pokemon Sun and Moon was a very good example of this. The game held your hand the entire time. It's like, hey, I need to go to this city, right? You're talking in this cutscene, this person tells you need to go to the city, okay, cool. While you're on the way there, you run into somebody else, and they're like, oh, hey, you should go to the city. Like, yeah, cool, I'm already going there. Then you run into somebody else, and they're like, hey, I'm going to the city, you should come with me. And I'm like, yep, that's what I'm doing. The entire game, it's telling you exactly what to do, where to go. It's not until the very end of the game, when the game gets a really weird difficulty spike out of nowhere, that they stop with all the hand-holding. As much as I do play Pokemon games, I hated that in Sun and Moon, and it's probably the main reason I will not go back and play those games. I will continue the save files I have in order to get certain things that I need. I don't think I will ever play through those games again. So then, Final Fantasy XIII, which ironically enough, as I am recording this, a good friend of mine, Sukonami, is on Twitch streaming the third game in the 13 series. We're talking about the first game. I loved that game. People always complain about it, they say how awful it was. I loved the story. The gameplay was a little lacking, I'll give you that. The story was fantastic. What wasn't was the hour or so long tutorial throughout the beginning of the game. And it just keeps going. I've read some things online about how the tutorials actually begin to stop. There's still some late game, like new mechanics, which is understandable. But the main tutorials actually slow down and actually stop when you're about 5 hours into the game. And this is an example of a game babying you. By that I mean, they act like it is baby's first game, where they tell you, on the Xbox version, that you need to press A to select things. On the PlayStation version, you have to press X to select things. That's standard. We know that. When a game tells you that you need to use the joystick to move another one to move the camera, we know that. If it is actually somebody's first time playing a game, then hopefully they can figure that out. More often than not, you're not introducing new people to games with Final Fantasy XIII. There's no need to go down the whole button layout of the controller when it's the same thing as it is in every other game. Staying with Final Fantasy 15 was a personal grievance of mine. When you first launched that game, it asked you for a new tutorial. Obviously, there aren't many games like Final Fantasy 15, I'm gonna say yes. The tutorial goes on for what feels like forever, and in the end it's pointless. Like, yes, at the beginning they're teaching you mechanics that are very important, but then they go on to explain mechanics that you're not even going to be using until way later in the game. And they go into super detail for seemingly no reason, because by the time you get to those new mechanics in the game, not only do they teach you how they work anyways, basically just redoing a tutorial again, you've already forgotten about them. You've already forgotten about that tutorial because you've been enjoying the story, you've been enjoying the game. Now you're 25 hours in and like, hey, here's a new thing. You're not going to remember what you did, a week or 2 weeks ago when you first did the tutorial. It's long and pointless. If you play through 15, just play the game. They handhold just enough throughout the main game that it's not in your face, but they teach you how to play. They teach you how the game works. The tutorial at the beginning of the game was awful. Granted, this is outdated information. I played the game when it first released. I was one of the weebs who went out and pre-ordered it. So, for all I know, they've fixed it. Then you also have Assassin's Creed 3, where the game begins and you're doing this long tutorial playing as Desmond within the Animus. And it's trying to teach you, all the basics of the game, which is fine. It goes on for a little while, not too bad. Then the game has you playing as Haytham Kenway, who you play as for a decent amount of time, but it basically just goes over everything you learned as Desmond, again as Haytham. There was no point. They gave you 2 tutorials for the exact same stuff for the same game. One was inside of this giant white Animus world. One was within, the actual Animus, playing as Haytham. There was no point. They could have cut out the whole Desmond part and just left it alone. I get they were trying to build the tutorial as a part of the story, but sometimes you just don't need to do that. The last example I have for this is Jet Set Radio. I tried to play through this game not too long ago, I'd say about 2 or 3 years ago, and I just couldn't. The tutorial went on for forever, and it was legitimately super challenging. It was to the point where the game would have you, do 20 tricks within so much time, do 30 trick combo within so much time. And you only have a limited space to do it, you're being timed for the most part, I don't think you're timed for all of it, to do these tricks and stunts in the tutorial before you've actually had good experience with the game. They eventually ask you to do a 50 trick combo within a time limit. It is so bad and so hard for people who aren't veterans of Jet Set Radio to do that when you look at the Steam achievements, only 4.4% of all players have been able to complete the tutorial. They're basically being gated out of the game. And there might be a way to skip the tutorial, I'm not positive, because there are some achievements that you would think you could only get after the tutorial, but maybe not. But 4.4% of players have been able to successfully complete the tutorial. It's ridiculous. You don't need to make your tutorials that hard, but you also don't need to baby somebody the entire time. It's weird how far to the opposite extreme Jet Set Radio really went on this. So anyways, I just wanted to complain for a little bit. If you guys liked the video, you want to see more stuff like this, let me know. I have a few other things that I want to do, and I know this is a very different kind of thing for the channel. If you enjoyed, please leave a sub and a like down below, and hopefully I'll see y'all next time. Bye.